The first thing I remember is the smell of antiseptic and the sound of a monitor beeping somewhere to my left. The second thing I remember is reaching for my phone to call my husband, and finding only an empty bedside table. I had been unconscious for 11 days. My name is Claire Morrison. I'm 38 years old. 3 weeks before the accident, I had finalized the sale of my architecture firm, the company I had spent 9 years building from a home office with second-hand drafting software and a business loan my mother co-signed. The final number on the wire transfer was $9.2 million. I remember sitting in the conference room after everyone had left, looking at the signed documents stacked neatly in front of me, and crying in a way I hadn't cried since I was a little girl. Not from sadness. From something that felt too large to name. I called my husband from the parking garage. He didn't pick up. I left a voicemail telling him I had something incredible to share and that I was coming home. I was still smiling when I pulled onto the interstate. The rain had started 20 minutes earlier. The semi that crossed into my lane on the bridge did so without warning. I did not know any of this when I woke up. The nurse on duty that morning told me, gently, in the careful way that medical professionals deliver information they've rehearsed, that I had been in a serious accident, that I had 2 broken ribs, a fractured collarbone, a traumatic brain injury that they were still monitoring, and that I was very lucky to be alive. I asked for my husband. She glanced toward the door. Just a flicker, the kind of look that people think they're hiding but never do. She told me she would go find the attending physician and that she would be right back. She was gone for a long time. The doctor who came in was a tall woman with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and an expression that told me she had delivered difficult news before. She explained my injuries in careful detail. She talked about the recovery timeline and the follow-up care I would need. She mentioned that I had been listed as a Jane Doe for the first 2 days because my identification had not been recovered from the wreck. I waited. I asked again about my husband. She sat down in the chair beside my bed, which is never a good sign. She said that as far as the hospital's records showed, no one had been listed as my emergency contact when I was admitted. She said that once my identity was confirmed, the hospital had made several attempts to reach my next of kin. She paused and chose her next words slowly. She said that the contact number they had for my husband had been answered once, and that the person who answered had told them they had the wrong number and hung up. I lay there with 2 broken ribs and a fractured collarbone and a brain that was still putting itself back together, and I thought about my husband's face when he laughed. I thought about the way he always burned the first batch of pancakes on Sunday mornings but made the second batch perfectly and pretended the burned ones hadn't happened. I thought about 11 years of marriage and the way he said my name when I walked into a room. I asked if I could borrow someone's phone. He didn't answer. I left a message. I called again from a nurse's cell phone an hour later using a different number. He picked up on the second ring. He said hello the way you say hello to a stranger. I said his name. I said it was me. I said I was in the hospital and I needed him. There was a silence that lasted long enough for me to understand that something was very wrong. He said, quietly and without any particular cruelty, that I should stop calling this number. Then he ended the call. I stared at the ceiling of my hospital room for a long time after that. The monitor beeped. The IV dripped. Somewhere down the hall, a television was playing a morning news program. My best friend Dana drove 4 hours from Cincinnati to be there by that evening. She walked into my room with a rolling suitcase, a bag of things she knew I would need, and an expression on her face that she was clearly trying to hold together. I knew Dana well enough to know that she only looked like that when she already knew something she didn't want to tell me. I asked her what was happening. I asked her to tell me everything. She sat down and took my hand and told me. My husband had told people I was dead. Not to everyone. Not in a public announcement. But to the people who mattered: our shared attorney, his family, our neighbors, the 2 couples we used to have dinner with on the first Saturday of every month. He had told them that I had been killed in the accident. That I hadn't survived. He had told our attorney this within 72 hours of the crash. He had told him that he needed to discuss the estate. Dana had found out because our neighbor had called her to express condolences. Not knowing that Dana and I were still in regular contact, Dana had tried to reach my husband immediately and had been blocked. She had then driven to the hospital, identified herself as my emergency contact, which she was, apparently, from the paperwork I had filed with my firm before the sale was finalized, which had not yet been updated in the hospital's own system, and had been sitting with this information for 3 days, waiting for me to be stable enough to hear it. I asked about the attorney. Dana said that our attorney, a man named Gerald who had handled the business sale and drawn up our estate documents, had told my husband that he could not release any assets or discuss the estate without a death certificate. She said Gerald had apparently been suspicious from the beginning and had told my husband he needed to come in with documentation. My husband had not yet produced anything. I said I needed to call Gerald. Dana handed me her phone. Gerald picked up on the first ring. He said my name with the particular relief of a man who has been hoping to hear a specific voice for some time. He said he had been trying to find a way to verify what he had been told without crossing lines he wasn't allowed to cross. He said he had made no disbursements. He said my accounts were frozen at my instruction. I had set up a precautionary freeze through my financial advisor the morning of the closing, which had gone into effect automatically. He said my husband had not known about this. He said there was something else. He said my husband had come into his office the previous week. He had not come alone. He had brought his wife. I heard that word and felt it move through me like cold water. Gerald said she was young. He said she seemed uncomfortable the entire time. He said she had barely spoken. He said when my husband introduced her, she had looked at a framed photograph on Gerald's desk, a photograph from our firm's opening, with me standing in front of the entrance, and she had gone completely still. He said she had grabbed my husband's arm and said she wanted to leave. He said my husband had dismissed her and continued pressing Gerald about the documentation. Gerald had ended the meeting shortly after. I asked Gerald if he had called the police. He said that what my husband had told him was told in the context of a legal consultation, and that the ethics of his position were complicated. He said he had contacted the state bar for guidance. He said he had been told that if he had reason to believe a crime was being actively committed against a living client, he had a duty to act, and that confirming my survival and protecting my assets was something he was both permitted and obligated to do. He said he was very glad I had called. I spent the next week making phone calls from a hospital bed with a fractured collarbone. I talked to Gerald every day. I talked to my financial advisor, who confirmed that my accounts were intact and secured. I talked to a family law attorney Dana found for me, a woman in her 50s named Patricia who had the calm, unhurried manner of someone who had seen every possible permutation of human betrayal and was no longer surprised by any of it. Patricia told me that what my husband had done, falsely declaring a living spouse deceased to gain access to marital assets, constituted fraud, and potentially a range of other charges depending on the jurisdiction and what else he had done in the intervening weeks. I asked about the woman he had brought to Gerald's office. Patricia said that was where it became complicated. She said that if my husband had represented to this woman that he was a widower and married her under false pretenses, then she too was a victim. She said I should not assume she knew the full picture. She said that before I assumed anything about anyone, I should try to find out more. I lay in my hospital bed that night and thought about this young woman in Gerald's office going still when she saw my photograph. I thought about her grabbing my husband's arm and saying she wanted to leave. I didn't know what to make of it. I filed it away. My husband's name was Marcus. He was 42 years old. We had met at a fundraiser for an urban development project 11 years ago. He had been charming and interesting and had seemed to genuinely admire what I was building. We had been happy, or I had believed we were happy, which I was now understanding were not necessarily the same thing. What I was learning, slowly, through Gerald and through Dana and through Patricia, was that the last 18 months of our marriage had been something I hadn't seen at all. He had opened a separate account 8 months before the accident and had been making small irregular transfers from our joint checking account, never more than $200 at a time, almost always under $100, often disguised within the same week as ordinary purchases. By the time of the accident, he had accumulated just over $14,000 in this account. He had also, in the 2 weeks before the accident, while we were still living in the same house, applied for 2 credit cards in my name using documents he had apparently accessed from my home office. That was where his early money came from. The suits, the hotel stays, the dinners out with a woman half a decade younger than me. It was my credit. My name. I had been home for 3 weeks, staying with Dana, when the call came. It was a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't pick up. When I did, there was a brief silence, and then a young woman's voice asked if she was speaking to Claire Morrison. I said yes. She said, very quietly, that her name was Nadia. She said she was sorry to bother me. She said she didn't know where else to turn. I said nothing. I waited. She said she had been married to Marcus Webb for 6 weeks. She said that when she agreed to marry him, she had believed his wife had died in a car accident on the interstate. She said he had shown her a death notice. She described what it looked like, and she said she had had no reason to question it. She said she had grown up without a father and had a complicated history, and that Marcus had seemed like someone stable and dependable, which she now understood she had been desperate enough to believe without looking closely. She said that the day he brought her to the attorney's office, she had seen a photograph on the desk. She stopped. I could hear her breathing. I asked her what she saw in the photograph. She said she saw a face she had been carrying in her memory for most of her life. She said she saw a face that her mother had shown her in a photograph of her own, a photograph her mother had kept in a cedar box in the closet and had never fully explained. She said she had asked her mother about the woman in that photograph many times. Her mother had always changed the subject. She said her mother had died 2 years ago. She said in the weeks after, going through her mother's belongings, she had found the cedar box. She had found the photograph. She had found other things, 2 letters, documents, things her mother had never shown her. I sat very still. She said her mother had been involved with a man in the late 90s. She said it had been brief, and the man had ended it without explanation and returned to his family, and her mother had never told him she was pregnant. She said the man's name was Robert Morrison. My father's name is Robert Morrison. I have not spoken to my father in 14 years. He left my mother when I was 24. He remarried someone else and moved to another city and gradually stopped returning calls. It was not dramatic. It was ordinary and devastating, and I had made peace with it the way you make peace with a wound that healed crooked. It didn't hurt constantly anymore, but certain movements still caught. Nadia was 24 years old. Her mother had been involved with my father in the late 90s, when I was a teenager. She had been born in 1999. When I was 14 years old, she was my half-sister. I want to describe what happened inside me in the moment I understood this, but I'm not sure I have the language for it. It was not a simple thing. It was layered and strange and moved through me in waves, each one carrying something different. There was grief first, grief for what neither of us had known. Grief for all the years that had existed alongside each other without touching. There was anger at my father, who was apparently capable of leaving not 1 but 2 families without accounting for what he left behind. There was something else too, quieter and harder to name, something that felt almost like recognition. I asked her if she was safe. She said she was staying with a friend. She said she had not gone back to the apartment she had shared with Marcus since the day at the attorney's office. She said she had taken her documents and the cedar box and left while he was out and had not told him where she was going. She said she was scared of what he would do when he realized she wasn't coming back. I told her to stay where she was. I told her I was going to give her Patricia's phone number. I told her that she needed legal counsel too, and that Patricia would tell her exactly what her rights were and what to do next. Then I said something I hadn't planned to say. I said, I've been looking at that same question my whole life and didn't know it. I said, I think we need to meet. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I think so too. What followed was not fast or simple. Patricia spent considerable time advising both of us separately, given that we had separate interests in the situation, though she helped connect Nadia with a colleague who could represent her independently. Marcus was served with papers on a Tuesday morning. Gerald cooperated fully with the investigators. The fraud charges that were eventually filed included wire fraud, identity theft for the credit cards he had opened in my name, and making false statements to an attorney for the purpose of obtaining access to estate assets. The bigamy question was technically complicated since no divorce proceedings had been filed, meaning Marcus was still legally married to me when he married Nadia, which created its own separate set of charges. The morning he was arrested, I was sitting in Dana's kitchen drinking coffee and watching the rain against the window. Dana came in and showed me the news notification on her phone without saying anything. I looked at it for a long moment, then I set my coffee down and went back to looking at the rain. People ask if I felt better when it happened. I felt something, but better isn't quite the right word. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes with being betrayed by someone you trusted for a long time. It doesn't lift dramatically. It fades gradually, like bruising, and some days you press on it and it still hurts and other days you forget it was ever there. I met Nadia for the first time in person on a Saturday in April, at a small restaurant in Columbus that Dana had chosen specifically because it was quiet and had good natural light and corner tables where you could sit with your back to the wall and not feel exposed. Dana drove me there and sat 2 tables away with her book and a glass of iced tea, close enough to be present and far enough to give us space. Nadia was already there when I arrived. She was sitting at the corner table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup. And she looked up when I walked in the way that people look up when they're not sure if they're hoping for something or terrified of it. She was dark-haired and had a particular way of holding herself that was careful and watchful, the body language of someone who had learned early to pay attention to rooms. She had my father's eyes. I had spent 24 years looking at those eyes in the mirror without realizing I was sharing them with someone I had never met. We sat across from each other for a moment without speaking. Then she reached into the bag beside her and set the cedar box on the table between us. Inside was a photograph. It was old and printed on the slightly glossy paper of the early 90s, the colors a little warm and faded the way photographs from that era always are. It showed my father standing in front of a car I recognized from my childhood, squinting slightly in the sun, his arm around a woman I didn't know. Beside the woman, half hidden behind her leg, was a small girl of maybe 3 or 4 with dark curly hair and enormous eyes. Below it, in a different slot, was another photograph. This one was of a teenager at what appeared to be a school event, holding a rolled-up certificate and looking directly at the camera with an expression that was part pride and part self-consciousness. The girl in this photograph was me at 14. I had no memory of this photograph being taken. I had no idea how it had ended up in a cedar box belonging to a woman I had never met. I looked at Nadia. I looked at the photographs. I thought about my father, who had been conducting 2 separate lives in the same city and had apparently kept track of both of us without ever letting us know the other existed. I said, "How long did your mother know about me?" Nadia said she thought her mother had known about me from the beginning. She said she thought her mother had followed my life quietly for years, not intrusively, not in a way that sought contact, but in the way of someone who needed to know that a piece of a person they had loved was still in the world. I thought about that for a long time. Here is what I know now that I didn't know before. That the people who raise us and love us are also people we never fully see, with entire interior lives and histories and choices that happened before we arrived and continued alongside us without our knowing. My father had been 2 different fathers in 2 different houses. Nadia's mother had carried a photograph of me for 20 years. Marcus had been building a separate future while eating breakfast across from me every morning. I had sold my company for $9.2 million and driven home to share the news with someone who was already in the process of deciding I was worth more dead than alive. I am not the same person I was before the bridge on the interstate. I'm not sure I'm worse for it. I am more careful now in ways that aren't cynicism, or I try to be. I am better at knowing the difference between the way someone acts around you and who they actually are. Though I know that skill has limits and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. My collarbone healed. My ribs healed. The brain takes longer, in ways that aren't always visible from the outside. Some mornings I wake up and the world is perfectly clear, and some mornings there's a slight haziness at the edges that my doctor says will continue to improve. I take it one morning at a time. The company I built exists now under different ownership, and I have the resources to do whatever I want next. I haven't decided yet. I've been taking the time to decide carefully, which is a luxury I didn't have before and don't take lightly. Nadia and I have had dinner 6 times since the restaurant in Columbus. We don't call each other sisters yet, out loud, though I think we both know that's what we are. It's a word that needs time to fit, after so long of not existing between us. We're learning each other slowly, the way you have to when you're starting from the beginning in the middle of 2 lives already in progress. She is sharp and observant and occasionally funny in a dry, quiet way that surprises me. She is working through her own anger at the situation at Marcus, at my father, at her mother's silence, and I recognize that anger because I lived inside something like it for a long time. Last month she texted me a photograph of 2 coffee cups side by side on a table at the place near her apartment where she works in the mornings. The caption said, "Reserved you a seat whenever you're in town." I looked at that photograph for a long time before I responded. Then I wrote back, "I'll be there Thursday." There is something I keep coming back to, in the quieter moments. It's not something I've fully resolved, more something I carry with me and turn over occasionally, the way you do with things that matter. It's the question of what we miss when we're not paying attention, and whether some of it was always going to be there waiting, patient and unhurried, until we were finally ready to see it. The night of the accident, I was driving home to tell my husband something wonderful. The road was wet. The semi crossed into my lane, 11 days later, I opened my eyes in a hospital room and everything I thought I knew about my life had shifted 3 inches to the left. And somewhere across that same city, a young woman I had never met was living inside a marriage built on a lie, carrying a cedar box of photographs she didn't fully understand, waiting for a story she didn't yet know she was part of. We don't get to choose where the road breaks. We only get to choose what we do when we find ourselves standing at the place where it did. I am still standing. That's where I start.